Hello, thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. My name is Chris Holmes, and I'm going to discuss some work that may be a bit different than the other talks in this session. We know that changes in habitat can have profound impacts to the flora and fauna of an area, and understanding how a habitat has changed over time can help inform ecological modeling. I'm going to talk about our work using satellite-based remote sensing to characterize change over time. I'd like to acknowledge the co-authors on this study, and you can see their names and affiliations on the right. Ecological effects modeling for population or community-level environmental risk assessment seeks to describe the interactions of biological, chemical, environmental, and anthropogenic factors in relation to stressor-response relationships. Effects modeling in the future won't simply be a local worst-case exposure risk scenario, except perhaps at the lowest tier. We'll see a move from point estimate to landscape scale estimates. Examining a landscape helps to understand recovery potential and how that might vary over space and time. Future risk management will look onto the entire landscape, covering many factors and stressors, and a change of grassland is one of those aspects to consider. From a landscape perspective, there are many types of grassland areas. Truly natural areas such as might be found in wilderness or other sites where changes are limited. Grazing and pasture areas are also grassland habitat where animal activities may have a minimal impact on the vegetation overall. Other more intensively managed grasslands include hayfields and silage production. These different grassland types provide excellent habitat for a variety of species and are interrelated with their abundance and overall populations. News of the decline in insect biomass over time has given rise to efforts in understanding potential causes in order to address and hopefully reverse this trend. We wanted to see if we could use historical remote sensing imagery to understand the change in grassland composition and management over time, and perhaps relate this to known changes in insect biomass, such as that reported by Holmes et al., who collected and analyzed data over a 27-year period in over 60 locations. Our study site is located on the western edge of Germany, near the town of Krefeld, which is also one of the locations in the Holmes work. We looked at the area within a 10-kilometer radius of an insect trap location, about 300 square kilometers, and using previously digitized land parcels, here shown in green, we selected the collection of grassland-related parcels, or polygons. As this was a remote sensing study, in which we intended to utilize historic satellite imagery with a ground resolution of 30 meters, which is quite coarse compared to many of today's optical data, we wanted to make sure that the image pixels we studied were as homogeneous as possible. To do this, we took the original grassland polygons, here in light yellow, and buffered them inwards by 30 meters, the heavy yellow lines. This process helped to reduce the chance of mixed pixels along the field edges. The examples shown here help to illustrate the variety of grassland types within the study area. We're fortunate to have access to a large collection of historical satellite imagery from NOAA's Landsat program going back to the 80s. Even more fortunate is that while this program utilized a number of actual satellites, they each carried a comparable multispectral sensor called the thematic mapper, and that digital information from the images and from different satellites are all consistent. For our study, we ultimately acquired and processed 166 images spanning 1989 to 2013 from all seasons. But to get to that set of 166 images, we had to review and evaluate over 700 images. There are a lot of reasons an image might not be suitable. The most common is cloud cover. Spectral remote sensing doesn't penetrate clouds, and images with too many clouds of our study area were discounted. For the collection of suitable images, we had to make sure that changes from one image to another, or one year to another, weren't simply a result of changes in image collection, like atmosphere or illumination or sun angle. Images with just a few scattered clouds in some areas but perfectly fine in others were processed to remove the clouds and their shadows, that's important too, so the rest of the image could be used. Finally, we can get to the point of actual image analysis, which in our case was to generate several vegetation indices as a measure of grassland biomass. Finally, we put the vegetation index maps for each year all together in one stack of 25 layers so we can perform some time series analysis. Image normalization is a critical consideration when performing a time series analysis, since we want to make sure changes we see are due to actual changes of the objects on the ground and aren't due to factors unrelated to land cover, like atmosphere and illumination. To understand normalization, you need to know a little bit about spectral images and how different wavelengths of electromagnetic energy interact with the Earth's surface and return to the sensor. Lots of things can happen in that pathway from the sun to the Earth to the sensor, and that's what we're trying to adjust for. So if we had a land cover, such as concrete, asphalt, or water, that don't really change over time, we can assume that any changes we see are due to other reasons, and we can remove that with image normalization. The figure on the upper right is an example where the near-infrared wavelengths of these static places from two images are plotted. The linear regression that describes that relationship can be applied to one image to make it comparable or normalized to the second. This is done over the whole image, not just for the static features used to generate the regression. And of course, each wavelength acts differently on the objects of Earth, so each one must be done separately. With 160 images over 25 years, we first normalized the April images from each year, and then all the images in a given year were normalized to the April image. This resulted in our 166 images all being comparable, so that changes in the images were due to changes on the ground. Rather than work with the raw image data in our time series analysis, we focused our analysis utilizing several vegetation indices. A vegetation index uses the specific way plant structure reflects wave energy at different wavelengths. You can see this spectral curve for several land cover types in the figure on the left. Using the distinct way healthy vegetation reflects red and near-infrared energy, the vigor of the vegetation can be determined. This is how the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index works, called the NDVI. This index has been used for many years and is probably the most commonly used vegetation index. With NDVI, larger numbers mean more intense or vigorous vegetation, which in turn indicates a greater amount of biomass at that location. Remember that 1 pixel on the ground is 900 square meters, so there can be a mixture of land covers within that 30 by 30 area. We also use the Moisture Stress Index, since this used a different wavelength, the middle infrared, than does the NDVI. Here, higher values mean greater water stress, which would imply less healthy vegetation, leading to less biomass. Finally, the Transformed Vegetation Index was used to help address one weakness in the NDVI, where it can saturate at the upper end of the biomass levels. Once we had that layer stack of 25 vegetation indices, we could start to look at how vegetation changed over time for each of those grassland polygons. We used a Kmeans clustering algorithm, which took those 25 values for each polygon and grouped them into a set number of clusters where they have the most similarity and the greatest separation. Here, each grassland polygon was put into one of 3 groups. The chart on the left shows the mean NDVI of the grassland polygons over the course of the year, with the 25-year time period on the x-axis. Because aspects not related to land cover can influence the NDVI, such as drought or weather, a time series was normalized to remove these variations, which influenced every grassland polygon in the image. This is the middle chart. In the right-hand chart, we can clearly observe 3 temporal trends in NDVI from 1989 to 2013. The purple cluster on top remains fairly constant over time. The yellow cluster increases early on and levels off close to the purple cluster. The dark green cluster is flat for the first 10 years or so, then climbs up to be almost the same as the other clusters. Keep in mind that higher NDVI means greater biomass in the field, so the biomass or productivity of some fields are changing over time while others remain fairly constant. We looked at how the 3 different vegetation indices influenced the clusters and which grassland polygons were assigned to them. If all 3 produce comparable assignments, this gave us more confidence in the clusters. The charts on the right show that when comparing grassland polygon assignments from the 2 different vegetation indices, somewhere between 73 and almost 90% of the polygons were in the same cluster. This tells us that the clustering process did a good job, and we have more confidence in the clusters and their associated trends. We also performed the same clustering and charting process, but specified 4 clusters in the Kmeans process. This seemed to provide a better separation of the grassland polygons that did change over time, the dark green and light green lines. Overall, in this analysis, about 15% of the grassland area had a relatively constant biomass until about halfway through, year 2000. Then the average biomass of these fields increased. This is the dark green class. About 17% of the grassland area that's the light green color, started to increase in biomass much earlier, about 1994, and reached the other two classes around the year 2000. NDVI is an indicator of vegetation biomass, and when there's an increase in the annual average NDVI, we could conclude that that same grassland polygon is producing more biomass over time. Since we remove large-scale annual effects such as weather or drought, the increase in biomass indicates more intensively managed grasslands, especially when fertilizer is used. So if we use changes in vegetation indices like NDVI as a proxy for this intensification, we've identified two periods of increasing intensification. The grassland polygons in the light green line show an increase in the mid-1990s, rising to the level of the yellow and purple clusters around the year 2000, and roughly comparable with those for the next 15 years. Within this study area, this corresponds to a period of reduction in dairy farming in the region, along with an increase of vegetation production for a new biogas generation plant. The dark green line remains lower until about 2005, and then increases to almost the level of the other three clusters. This may indicate conversion of grasslands to more intensive silage production. Further analysis of the lowest NDVI class showed a decrease in the variability within that class over time, indicating a loss of diversity across those grassland polygons. And lower diversity in grassland management likely has an impact on biodiversity of the landscape as a whole. We've demonstrated the feasibility of utilizing information from freely available satellite image archives for habitat characterization of landscape patterns and changes over a 25-year period. We showed that grassland clusters display different patterns over time, and that our three vegetation indices produce comparable results. The approach we've demonstrated here is applicable across geographies and time periods, and the results are suitable for spatially explicit landscape-level ecological modeling. While this work is still ongoing, we do know that grassland areas are important habitats for some groups of insects, and understanding historic changes in grassland extent and management provides a key factor in the study of landscape-level ecological effects modeling. We're now completing a comparable analysis in the von Bachtal area in Germany and aim to have a publication out in 2021. Thank you for your time.